Well, my name's Ross Walters, and I'm a magistrate judge in the Southern District of Iowa, and I'm interviewing a colleague of mine, Judge Tom Shields, who's also a magistrate judge in the Southern District of Iowa. And the occasion is that Judge Shields is about to, enter on another adventure. He's going to be retiring before too soon, so we thought we would talk to him about This Is Your Life, basically, and go over some history and just some reminiscence and talk about your job and lots of other things.
Okay.
But you are Tom Shields, right?
I am.
You're a Hoosier.
I'm a Hoosier, born and raised.
Born and raised. And my understanding is you were raised in Richmond, Indiana.
Richmond, Indiana.
Right.
Right, eastern Indiana.
And your parents were, you were adopted,
I was adopted.
at age 8 months.
8 months.
And your parents, your adoptive parents,
My father was Thomas Scott Shields. My mother was Margaret Ann Shields. My father was a physician, an ear, nose, and throat specialist. My mother was a registered dietitian.
and it's my understanding that your father had quite a colorful career in World War II, did he not?
Well, he did. And he was finished medical school close to the end of the 1930s, I think around 1939, and felt pretty confident that there was going to be a war. And so he enlisted in the Army Air Corps as a medical officer, and did training in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and was among the first wave to go overseas after Pearl Harbor. Went through the North African and the Sicilian invasions. His commanding officer for a good number of years was Elliott Roosevelt, the son of the President Franklin Roosevelt, and so yes, he was at the forefront of all that was going on, and as a flight surgeon, saw a lot of different things occur.
Then, and actually commanded a base at some point in the U.S.
He was very fortunate. At age 28, he was a lieutenant colonel, and had been overseas long enough that he earned the right to be rotated back to the States, ended up as commanding officer of Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs, which I think is maybe still in existence, or at least historically is in existence. And it was a little odd because he was a medical flight officer, flight surgeon, and normally medical officers are not commanders of bases, but at that time all of the pilots and other non-medical personnel who would have outranked him were overseas. So he was chief medical officer and base commander.
He stayed in the reserves, right?
Stayed in the reserves until the time of his death in 1974.
Now, he practiced in Richmond.
He did.
Indiana, down near Dayton, I think. Is that right?
About 35 miles from Dayton, Ohio, 60 miles from Cincinnati, so I can put it, grew up a Cincinnati Reds fan.
Still?
Still.
How about
Tough sometimes.
How about the Bengals?
Not so much.
Okay.
Then it was the Cleveland Browns were the big local pro football team.
Well, then you came along in 46?
1947.
1947.
Right.
And a sister, too.
Sister in 1949.
In 1949. And you grew up in Richmond.
I did.
Went to high school.
Went to high school there.
Graduated what year?
1965.
1965. Do anything fun in high school? Did you play some sports?
Played football, played basketball, was in sports until I ruptured my spleen, and that was a pretty good indication maybe it was time to stop, and I wasn't that good anyway. And I was active in student council, president of the junior class, vice president of the school, and so I had fun.
Well, good. But you graduated.
I did graduate.
Survived your childhood.
I did.
Went off to, where was it?
Started at Wabash College in Crawfordsville, Indiana, and was there a semester. Fortunately for me, I got sick, and mononucleosis, which I shouldn't have gotten again, but I did. And I wasn't happy there anyway. It may have contributed to that illness, and so I left and in the fall of 1965 and enrolled at the College of William & Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia in January of 1966.
And you were, what'd you major in?
History.
Well, you met somebody there, I think.
I met my wife. She was from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, California girl, born in Long Beach, California, but by that time had been a resident in Cedar Rapids. She was a graduate of Washington High School in Cedar Rapids, and so we met almost at the time that I arrived on campus, and then we were introduced later by her former boyfriend, and the rest is history, I guess, after 45 plus years.
That's right. And you got married, though, while you were in college.
We were married between our junior and senior years.
Right. Well, you graduated with your history degree. Now, Chris was elementary education?
She graduated with an elementary education degree.
And then it was off to law school.
Off to law school.
Why did you decide to go to law school?
What else are you going to do with a history degree?
I
had a cousin who was
exactly my thought.
Yeah. I think because of being a history major and becoming immersed in the history of law to some degree, and there's no better place to study history in my viewpoint than Williamsburg, Virginia. So you get a dose of not only the colonial history but the history of the Civil War, and it instilled in me a real interest in research. I knew I wasn't capable of being a doctor. That was not my area of interest or even expertise. My grades reflected that pretty handily. And I like arguing. I like public speaking, and I like people. So it seemed like a good fit.
You went to school in Indiana.
Correct.
At the University of?
Indiana University in Indianapolis Law School. There continue to be two law schools, Indiana University law schools, one in Indianapolis, one in Bloomington.
All right. And there for 3 years.
3 years. My wife taught school, elementary school, second grade, in Warren Township, suburban Indianapolis district. I was fortunate at that time. My mentor in law school was James P. White. Grew up in Iowa City. Had his cousin Patrick White was longtime Johnson County attorney, and we gravitated toward each other, I guess. And so through him, I was fortunate enough to obtain a Lilly Foundation fellowship, and I worked in the office of Richard Lugar, who at that time was mayor of Indianapolis, and I was fortunate to do that for 2 years.
And then you graduated.
Then I graduated.
And that's when you came to Iowa.
Came to Iowa. I was fortunate, a classmate who had graduated from the law school 2 years prior to me, and who I knew to some degree, had come to Iowa, was clerking for Judge Roy Stevenson, who by that time was a circuit judge. And he had kind of recruited some of us from the law school there, and I got in contact with Judge Stewart and came out and interviewed with him.
Judge William Stewart.
Judge William Stewart.
Southern District of Iowa, from Sheraton. Why don't you, people who may see this sometime in the future might not know who Judge Stewart was. Why don't you tell us about him?
Judge William C. Stewart was one of the most amazing and great people I've ever met, and certainly did more to shape my interest in the law and my understanding of the law and my dedication to the law. He started out practicing with his father in Sheraton, Iowa. The firm was in existence for, I think, pretty close to 100 years by the time he left. But Judge Stewart first was a state legislator, then was actually a senator, was appointed to the Iowa Supreme Court, and then in 1971 was appointed United States District Judge for the Southern District of Iowa, and filled the position that Judge Stevenson had vacated when he was elevated to the circuit.
My understanding, your interview with him was kind of interesting.
It was an interesting interview. I drove from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where my wife and I were visiting her parents, and drove to Des Moines on a Saturday, met the judge here at the courthouse, and after we talked and went through some things for 45 minutes, an hour at the most, asked me if I liked antiques, and I said, I grew up with antiques. My mother was a great collector of antiques. So he said, well, I'm going to go meet my wife. She's at auctions. And so I went with him, and we went to any number, right now I can't remember, of garage sales and a few auctions. And so what I thought was going to be a 1 or 2 hour interview on a Saturday morning turned out to be almost an all-day event.
Let me back up a little bit. I think was it in law school that you and Chris had your first child?
Our first child, son, Scott, was born April 1, 1972, so about a month, 6 weeks before I graduated.
So the whole family moves to Des Moines first.
Moved to Des Moines, correct.
Now, you had passed the Indiana bar by then.
I did.
But you had to get admitted to the Iowa bar.
I didn't have to at that point, other than because of my commitment to Judge Stewart. When he made the offer to me to serve as his law clerk, the only thing that he asked me to affirmatively agree to was that I would make my best efforts to stay in Iowa and practice law once I finished my clerkship. And that was an easy thing to agree to. I liked Iowa and saw no reason why I would not want to stay there. And I agreed. And so as a result, I needed to take the Iowa bar. And I did. And at that time, before the multi-state, the 2 exams each year, one in June, I believe, and one in January at the Masonic Temple.
Now, did you, when we visited earlier, you told me a story about C. Edwin Moore and talking about Judge Stewart. Was that when you were sworn in as a new Iowa lawyer, or how did that come
No,
about?
that was a fun experience, because obviously not being from Iowa and not knowing anyone here other than Judge Stewart and a few other people. But when I was applying to take the Iowa bar, I had to have my application signed by a judge of an Iowa court. And federal court didn't count. And Judge Stewart, having been a member of the Supreme Court, knew just who I should see, and he called the Chief Justice, C. Edwin Moore, and asked him if it would be all right if I came to visit him and had him review my application and, if appropriate, sign it. And the chief said, "Sir, come on up." And so I did, and it's a great experience. I'd never been to the State House before, and went in and sat down and met with the Chief Justice one-on-one, and we chatted, and he was just a very gregarious, friendly person, and gave me a few digs at being a Hoosier as opposed to a Hawkeye, and then signed my application. And as I was getting ready to leave, he looked at me and he said very seriously, "Tom, when you get back down the hill, I want you to ask Bill Stewart one question. Why would any judge of the highest court of the state leave it for the lowest federal court in the country?" I delivered that message as I was directed by the Chief Justice, and as you can imagine, Judge Stewart got a great laugh out of that. And with his sense of humor, I think after I left his office, I think he called the Chief Justice, and they had a great laugh together.
What was it like working for Judge Stewart?
It was an amazing experience. He such a human person, and I realize that's kind of a contradiction in terms, but he was so caring about everyone, whether it was staff, lawyers who appeared before him, litigants and defendants. It didn't matter. And he was a great inspiration, not only about keeping your feet on the ground and not becoming over self-important, but also recognizing what lawyers and judges were supposed to do, and that was to honor their oath and serve the system and serve the people. And he was a marvelous mentor in terms of his immense patience. It was, for me, as a history buff, not to mention history major, as many people know, but many don't. Bill Stewart was now Kinnick's roommate at the University of Iowa. And so there were some great stories that he could tell me as I was learning about Iowa and learning about now Kinnick, and he shared with me on some occasions letters that he had written to Niall Kinnick's parents and responses that were very personal, but there was just an immense amount of love and respect between Bill Stewart and Niall Kinnick, and with Judge Stewart and Niall Kinnick's family. And so that was a marvelous connection for someone who was just new in the state.
But, and you mentioned new in the state. He, as a mentor, did he also help you meet other judges and lawyers and people who would be an influence on your professional life after that?
Clearly, because he knew most people in the state, for sure. And I think at the time, if I'm recalling correctly, Judge Stewart had been appointed in 1971. I was his first full-term law clerk for a 2-year term. There was another law clerk here when I arrived who had been hired on a limited term. And so we had a lot of work to do because the position had been vacant for a while after Judge Stevenson had been elevated. So I think the first year of my 2-year clerkship, we spent, I would say, nearly half the year in Davenport because there was no resident judicial officer in Davenport. There was no anything in Davenport other than the courthouse and 2 deputy clerks. And so the docket was in a horrible shape. So we did a lot of travel, and we did a lot of weeks in Davenport. And that, in hindsight, with a new baby, wasn't easy on my wife, I know that. But when you travel, and you know this from traveling with your judge, you develop a greater intimacy and friendship than just when you walk in the door every day and spend 8 or 9 or 10 hours in the office and leave. Because when you're on the road, you have dinner together, things come up that you need to deal with, and that was just an incredible experience for me.
You mentioned my judge, who you probably met also, William C. Hanson, who I worked for several years as a law clerk.
Right.
And he and Judge Stewart, I think, were the judges here.
They were the judges. At that time, Judge Hanson was the roving judge, so to speak, because he had the commission in both the Northern District of Iowa and the Southern District of Iowa. So we didn't see him as often as we'd liked, simply because he had duties in both districts.
Well, you had committed to staying in Iowa. You told Judge Stewart you'd do that.
Correct.
So your 2 years as a law clerk is coming to an end in about, right now, we're up to about 1974, right?
Correct.
Law school graduate in 72. And then your clerkship was up in 74. So you're looking around for jobs. Now, you don't have to name all the law firms that weren't lucky enough to hire your services, but you did, as my understanding, get some offers, but you ended up at Lane and Waterman in Davenport. How did all that happen?
Well, it was interesting. I was very fortunate, and you're right. I obviously, working for someone like Bill Stewart was a great entree to law firms if you wanted to interview. And I had some great interviews in Des Moines, Cedar Rapids, nothing in Davenport immediately. And I also, in fairness, I interviewed with some firms in Indiana. And wasn't sure where I wanted to be, and by the time I was looking to interview, my father had been diagnosed with serious cancer. He died in the fall of 1974 after I had left my clerkship. So there was some real emotional tugs at that point as to where I needed to be and where I wanted to be. And I had very fortunate, had I would say 6 or 8 very good offers in Iowa, and when I was in the process of choosing among those offers, the offer from Lane and Waterman in Davenport just sort of popped to the surface, and that was the one I ultimately accepted. And after looking at all of the different alternatives, I felt that was the best fit for me.
You went there in '74,
I did.
and you practiced law at Lane and Waterman, I think, would have been for 26 years.
Correct.
Counting the part-time, you were a part-time magistrate judge, right?
Right.
And you started out, I found this interesting when I looked at your CV, as a special partner. That didn't necessarily mean you were special, as I understand it.
Well, I thought I was.
Well, I'm sure. No, you can claim to be.
That's right. You can claim anything, but
that was sort of an associate position, basically.
it was an associate position, and I think maybe as you and I discussed at a different time, Lane and Waterman had used the special partner designation continuously since World War II. It was devised to get around the wartime limits on salary increases and benefits, and by calling associate special partners, apparently that was good enough to pass muster. And I think Lane and Waterman retained the special partner status well into my tenure there. I don't honestly remember. I'm sure now it's been changed.
And eventually, of course, you became a non-special partner, a regular partner.
Just a good old regular partner, that's right.
In your practice, you were a litigator.
I was a litigator.
And tell me about the kinds of things you did, and also as your career developed, if you developed a focus on a certain area.
Well, in 1974, new lawyers were still lucky enough to be thrown into the subrogation mix in terms of litigation. Lane and Waterman did absolutely no criminal work.
A big help to you later on when you became a magistrate.
That was a great help. And maybe I spoke too strongly when I said absolutely none. But through the years as a young lawyer at Lane and Waterman, I did do every now and then the odd OWI defense for a client or a client's child, but was the extent of any real involvement with criminal practice at that firm. So the young lawyers got experience by, as Lane and Waterman did, representing big insurance companies and medium and small insurance, but in small claims court, because there were always subrogation claims made by someone suing an insured, and a great way to learn the free-for-all way of trial work. And if you lost, you didn't walk away feeling like you just put your client into immediate jeopardy or bankruptcy, because we're probably talking, the jurisdiction then, I think, might have been $1,000 in small claims court. Mm-hmm. And so, it was great fun. And it got myriad opportunities to cross-examine, to lay foundation, to argue with judges, and I don't think that's available anymore, and it's a shame.
But you were a trial lawyer, not just a litigator, but you actually tried a fair number of cases.
I did.
And I think I'd asked you, between '74 and 2000, when you became a full-time magistrate judge,
right,
about how many cases do you estimate you let's say, took to verdict?
Close to, or maybe right at 200.
All right. And the kinds of cases you typically tried were?
Well, starting out,
did it change over the years?
They did change, because I did personal injury work, defense work, a very, very, very few number of plaintiffs' cases, and I'm not sure I can remember any that I did, but I had a few. But initially, it was personal injury, defense, car accidents. I got into some interesting air crash cases. One of those, with one of my senior partners, Bob Van Voren, was a major case involving the deaths of people as a result of an aircraft owned by Professor Randall Zanson's father, or his corporation, More America. And so, but slowly through that, I developed a practice where I was pretty much specializing in defending doctors and dentists in professional malpractice cases. I also was very fortunate. I had a good number of cases from Ford Motor Company involving not only product liability but also dealer issues, and likewise the same with Volkswagen.
What's the longest lasting jury trial you ever had?
That was a trial before Judge Viator, and
Of this court?
Of this court, and I believe, and I think Hal will be happy to correct me, but I think it was 6 weeks, and it was done in Davenport over Judge Viator's objections, but that's the way it was.
I imagine, if I know you, you were the lawyer insisting on Davenport. You don't have to admit that.
I will admit that.
Okay.
And my client agreed with me because I convinced my client, and I think rightly so, that we would have, in that particular case, a better jury pool. And we ended up prevailing.
So, yes. You did.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's an awful lot of trial work. I don't think young lawyers are exposed to so many jury trials these days, unless they're taking a few criminal appointments, or a lot of them.
I'm afraid you're right.
Right.
And that's unfortunate, I think.
Well, now, when did you first become interested in becoming a judge?
That's a good question. I think most people who talk with me about that assume, well, once you finished your clerkship, you immediately knew you wanted to be a judge, and I really didn't at that point. And I think my first real interest in it was in about 1979 or 80. The chief judge of the 7th Judicial District, which was headquartered in Davenport, Nathan Grant, great judge, was retiring. And I considered it, talked to people. Several people came to me and said, we think you ought to apply for this. We think you would have a very good chance of obtaining this judgeship. I thought about it, looked at things. At that time I was still an associate, special partner at Lane and Waterman. Hard to believe now when I say this, but I actually would have made more money as a judge than remaining in the firm. And so I had determined, I talked to my wife, and we felt we could do this. And so I thought I needed to go to the source. So I called Judge Stewart, and I told him what I planned to do. And of course he was very familiar with Judge Grant. And after we went through the pros and the cons, Judge Stewart, just out of the clear blue, said, so I take from all that you've told me is that you've now decided you do not want to send your children to college. And all of a sudden it hit me, and that sobered me, and that ended my immediate desire to be a judge. But that desire remained lit.
Now, there was another local judge that I think you knew, Clay LeGrand.
I did, and that was through Judge Stewart. Clay LeGrand was a Scott County judge, had been a district judge, was on the Supreme Court with Judge Stewart. They were very, very close personal friends and maintained that close relationship, not only the two of them, but their wives, and even after Judge Stewart went on the federal bench. And when I was told the judge I had decided to accept the offer from Lane and Waterman, and instead of staying in Des Moines or going to Cedar Rapids, he immediately called Justice LeGrand and said, my law clerk's coming to Davenport, and I'm going to send him to your office. And so when I got to Davenport, I went to the Scott County Courthouse and met Justice LeGrand, and we became good friends from that time on. He really took me under his wing, and just an amazing man. And one of the things I remember Justice LeGrand saying when we were talking about my experience as a law clerk and working with Judge Stewart, and I made some comments about that, and Justice LeGrand said, well, you know, there are some judges who are judges, but Bill Stewart is a lawyer's judge. And he said, I think that's the most important kind of judge you can be. And as I thought about that, from then on, I started to realize exactly what he was talking about. And that really, I think, coupled with encouragement from Judge Stewart and my own thoughts, kind of put me back on track as to later wanting to be a judge.
Now I want to back up again a little bit, but you, through your experience and your involvement as a litigator, were selected for the American College of Trial Lawyers, as I understand it.
I was very, very fortunate to be nominated for that and voted into the college, and it was a great honor. Still is.
And you're a judicial fellow now, or what's it called?
I am now a judicial fellow because once I became a full-time member of the judiciary, I could no longer be a fellow.
But even before that, you were selected for the Iowa Academy of Trial Lawyers.
That's correct. Yes, and that was that I was totally surprised, and that was a few years before I was selected for the American College, and
I think that membership is quite limited, as I understand it.
I think it is. I think after you and I talked earlier, I think I checked that, and at least now it's limited to 250 lawyers in the state of Iowa, the Iowa Academy, and it may have been that same number or fewer at the time I was inducted, which I think was around 1985 to 89. I'm not sure exactly when.
Now, also during this time period, your two other children were born in Davenport, or?
Yes, my son Scott was born in Indianapolis. My daughters Elizabeth and Kathleen were born in Davenport.
All right. Now, you've been practicing for law for a long time. You're in the Iowa Academy, soon to be in the American Academy. You're a partner. You've got a very successful practice. And then in 1997, there were some changes in our court in the Southern District of Iowa, and a part-time position was created. And that did that rekindle your interest at that time?
It did, because the ability to be part of the federal bench by that time was of greater interest to me than being a state court judge, although I still was weighing whether I might have an opportunity to go on the state bench. But this just sort of materialized, and it resulted, there was a very part-time magistrate judge in Burlington at that time. And the judges of this district recognized there needed to be some judicial presence in Davenport. The docket was getting heavier. The United States Attorney's Office in the Southern District of Iowa had joined with the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Central District of Illinois, which is right across the Mississippi River, and a joint office had been established for both districts in Rock Island, Illinois, and there was a lot of business. And and I believe also, if I'm not mistaken, the part-time position in Council Bluffs was considered, and the ultimate resolution was there would be a part-time, nearly half-time position in Davenport, and removing the part-time magistrate judge in both Burlington and Council Bluffs.
Now, you had mentioned earlier that when you were with Judge Stewart, the Davenport courthouse had the two deputy clerks, and the old courtroom that we know about that didn't see a lot of activity. I think the post office was there.
Correct.
And some other government offices.
Right.
But in 1997, that's the first time that there was going to be a judicial office, federal judicial officer posted in Davenport, correct?
Correct.
For the reasons that you just indicated.
And one that I should add too, part of the plan in having this half-time magistrate judge in Davenport was that magistrate judge would also be cross-designated into the Central District of Illinois, because while Rock Island, Illinois also had a fully functioning federal courthouse, it likewise had no resident judicial officer.
And well, that new part-time judge was going to basically become the Quad Cities
That's
federal
right.
judicial officer. Well, you applied. Did your law firm support you?
My partners were very supportive, and I, to this day, appreciate what they gave up and what they allowed me to do to pursue this desire.
But now, maybe we ought to pause for a minute because we're talking about a magistrate judge position, and this will move to part-time.
Right.
How does the selection process work? How are you selected?
Well, you apply, and it's so long ago I'm not remembering, but I don't remember interviewing with a committee or commission. My recollection is that the people who wanted that position applied for it, and the judges then sat down with those candidates they wanted to interview and did that and then made their selection.
I remember. I participated in the interviews.
Okay.
You probably don't remember. I
honestly,
probably sat
don't.
there and didn't say much. But you got picked.
I was fortunate to be selected.
It's always seemed to me that, in a sense, the way I put it is you kind of opened up the shop in Davenport. So you start, and how do things get rolling? You've got nobody there with you other than the two clerks, and you brought your secretary from.
Well, I really
kind of.
You're right. Part-time magistrates then, and I'm not sure now, but then had no ability to have a staff. My understanding is that the law firms that the magistrate judges, part-time magistrate judges might be members of, would be reimbursed for necessary support. But in this particular instance, we had a chief deputy clerk who looked at the situation, Rob Raker. He suggested, because at that time the clerk's office was looking to hire an additional deputy court clerk, he suggested that my secretary at Lane and Waterman apply for that job with the idea that she would be a deputy clerk and would then be able to handle any matters that I needed to be handled as a judge. And I think his reasoning was very prescient and very good. He could see the problem of having a private law firm staff have to deal with federal court documents and matters that should not be done outside the courthouse.
So Debbie Moses was here,
Debbie Moses?
secretary, and she agreed to come over and work in the clerk's office for a while you were part-time.
She did, and she trained and learned all of the duties of a courtroom deputy, which was very helpful as we moved through the period of being a part-time magistrate judge, and which she was able to handle all my necessary paperwork.
Well, what did you do as a part-time magistrate judge?
As a part-time magistrate judge, I was permitted to remain in practice, with the exception I could not have any type of litigation work in the federal court. That was a disappointment. That was a hurdle that almost stopped me from applying for the position, because I really enjoyed federal work more than I did, in fact, state court work. But I reconciled that, and so primarily what I was doing was all criminal. Very little civil work of any type. Occasionally I might get a request to do some civil motion things from a judge, but I don't remember doing a lot of that.
But as things developed, there was the U.S. attorneys. There was a combined office in Iowa, Central District of Illinois.
Right, it was in Rock Island.
It was in Rock Island, but they were growing and becoming more active.
Right.
That area, my understanding was, had been kind of underserved by the Justice Department in a sense for many years.
Absolutely.
Probation officers were being hired.
When I started as part-time, there were 2 probation officers and a probation assistant.
Right.
For the Southern District, and they were housed in the Davenport courthouse.
And that staff was growing, I assume.
Well, it didn't.
Over the years.
It didn't immediately, but it started to grow later. Yes.
All right. Well, I've heard it said that being a part-time magistrate judge is like having two full-time jobs. Is that the way it was for you?
It turned out to be that way because I felt, in fairness to my partners, I needed to continue to carry my full weight at the firm. It was a fair arrangement. I turned over my entire earnings as a magistrate judge to the firm, and I continued to receive my regular proportional draw, which I thought was very fair. But I also felt I should maintain my workload as much as I could, and I did. And I continued trying cases in state court and doing all the other things related to that.
Didn't that get a little tiring?
It did get tiring, and in fact, in the midst of that, my asthma returned and was diagnosed as being stress-related, so no surprise there.
Right. Well, you were hired on as a part-time magistrate judge for a 4-year term, as I understand it.
That's correct.
But then, in the year 2000, the part-time position that you were in was going to become a full-time position.
Actually, just a little bit late 1999, it was announced that the position would be going full-time. And it was interesting because I had told Chief Judge Longstaff at that point that I would not apply for reappointment to the part-time magistrate position because I felt that I couldn't do justice to both jobs, and felt that I had gained what I could gain being a part-time magistrate. And shortly after I told him I would not apply, the announcement was made that the position was going to be converted to full-time.
And you went through the application process then all over again.
I did.
And were appointed as a full-time magistrate judge.
I was.
This time the term's 8 years, right?
That's right. And I misspoke, I think. I don't think Judge Longstaff was chief judge at that point. I think Judge Woolley was chief judge.
Right.
But Judge Longstaff and I had been longtime friends for obvious reasons, and having worked together for 30-some years, and he was the one who had encouraged me originally to apply for the part-time magistrate position. So he was the one I went to, and when I said I'm not going to reapply in that position.
Well, Judge Longstaff, when you were here as a law clerk for Judge Stewart, would he have been the clerk of court then?
He was clerk of court and part-time magistrate.
And part-time magistrate. Okay.
Yes, and it was, and in later years then became the first full-time magistrate judge in this district.
And then became a district judge.
And then became a district judge.
Now you're a full-time magistrate judge. How did your work change?
Well, the immediate difference was the immense amount of civil work that I was able to do and could do, including trying consent cases. And in 2000 and probably up to 2006 or 7, I think all of us as magistrate judges were trying 5, 6, 7, maybe more jury trials a year.
Not so many these days.
Not so many these days, unfortunately. And that was an interesting process because in the last year of my part-time magistrate position, and while I was still at Lane and Waterman, and I went back and looked because I sometimes thought I might have embellished this myself, just as we do, and I did in the last year try 9 jury trials as a lawyer while I was still a part-time magistrate judge. Now that was all in state court. So when I became a judge, I was primed to keep going, and I wanted to try cases, and fortunately I was able to do that. But taking on a civil docket, and at that time, as you'll recall, we were paired one-on-one with district judges, and so at that time I was paired with Judge Pratt.
And all that eventually changed because then we were all randomly paired with judges on a case. Probably people listening to this should know that one of the trials magistrate judges conduct are civil trials.
Correct.
With the consent of the parties.
Correct.
And let's see, you were doing the same criminal work you were doing before.
Yes.
which would have been initial appearances, arraignments, detention hearings.
And I think in 2000, your memory may be better than mine, I'm pretty confident in 2000 the magistrate judges were not yet doing guilty pleas in felony cases.
That started a little later.
It started a little later,
Right.
right. So, yeah.
But eventually. But now, on the civil side, on the cases that you were working, not only your consent cases, but the others you were paired on, you're also doing a lot of basically all the pretrial civil motions.
That's correct.
Except dispositive.
And
motions.
discovery issues, and yeah,
Right.
the whole range.
Well, Davenport's was still developing, and at some point the courthouse was remodeled.
It was in essence, to a large degree, gutted, and
Became just a federal courthouse.
that's correct. The post office moved out. Post office was happy to move out because that had been a sore spot with the postmaster anyway, because it was a drag on the post office budget. The IRS moved out. Wage and Hour office moved out. The Senator Grassley and Senator Harkin moved their offices out. At one point, Senator Grassley had indicated he wanted to remain in the courthouse, but I think his staff convinced him when they realized we were going to be putting in security sensors and a checkpoint, so to speak. I think they felt, for obvious reasons, that wasn't real good constituent relationship. So Senator Grassley then decided that he would relocate also. So now, and it has been since we reopened, the U.S. Attorney's office is in the courthouse, the United States Probation Office is in the courthouse, the marshals, who have the entire top floor, and the court.
Well, and where there was one courtroom before, now there are three.
Correct.
And
all three are jury capable.
And fully technological and all of that. Pretty much.
In two of the three are.
All right. Now, during the remodel, you were officed over in Rock Island?
We were. And I can say I had a happy role in that. There was a big angst and problem because GSA was coming up with some really bad ideas for where the court should relocate during the remodeling. It was agreed by all of the district judges that based upon the experience remodeling the Des Moines courthouse, that trying to keep the courthouse open and running and doing remodeling at the same time was not compatible. In fact, as I recall, the remodeling in this courthouse took a long time.
It did.
And with the Davenport facility being so much smaller, it was, of course, easier. So as we were going through all these good and bad, I wouldn't say good, I'd say bad and mediocre suggestions, I just happened to think about it and recommended to the judges that we consider relocating to Rock Island, which had no sitting judge and hasn't until the last 2 or 3 years. And the judges took a look at it and decided that looked like a pretty good idea. And
but we'd bring Iowa jurors over to Illinois.
That's correct.
To try cases. And I think, didn't the Congress pass a special statute to allow us to, with the consent of the criminal defendants, actually try the cases in Illinois?
That's correct. Judge Colleton was very instrumental. He knew from his experience working with the Justice Department and his prior career that he knew who to go to. And a bill was passed by Congress, and it was of limited duration, but as you say, it would allow, with the consent of a criminal defendant, a criminal jury trial to be conducted in the Central District of Illinois using Iowa jurors. But if the defendant did not agree, then the trials would be held in Des Moines. And most of the defendants agreed, but a few did not. My recollection is we did not need that type of approval to do civil jury trials in Rock Island.
My recollection is we didn't either. I think we all tried some civil cases over there.
Right.
So that was about a 3 or 4 year process?
2003 to 2006.
Then we're back in the new courthouse, which is really nice.
Right. Well, back in the new old courthouse.
New
Remember,
old
that's
courthouse.
built in 1931.
That's true. But the courthouse was, many parts of it, including the old courtroom, were restored.
Correct.
With copies of the original chandeliers and things like that. And it's a beautiful, beautiful building, and that courtroom in particular.
It is probably one of the nicest federal courtrooms in the Midwest, for sure. And interesting aside, when I was clerking with Judge Stewart, 1972 to 74, we went through the energy crisis that some of us will remember. And the GSA hit upon a marvelous idea. Let's brick up the big windows in the historic courtroom because that will be energy efficient. So the GSA bricked up the windows and bought expensive, huge curtains that covered them, and the windows remained that way until the remodeling began in 2003, and under the terms of congressional approval, courthouses that are remodeled must be restored to their original condition. And you can argue that because we spent a lot of money, we being the taxpayers, on recreating chandeliers and doors that had been thrown away by careless people over the years.
it wasn't an easy process.
No, it wasn't. But certainly one of the benefits was that the windows were unbricked, and if energy efficient windows were installed, and now the courtroom is magnificent.
It truly is. It's a beautiful building, I think.
It is. It's well maintained, and because of the ever-present security issues, the basement of the building was opened and a ramp was built in a vacant alleyway, and now there's parking under the building, and it allowed the marshals to have an interior sally port, which under the original plans they would have had a sally port in the alley behind the courthouse, which was a very big security risk, and it would have been open, and it would have been not a good idea.
All along, you're still doing work in the Central District of Illinois.
Correct.
In fact, is it fair to say that you were doing most of the initial criminal work? When I say initial appearances, detention hearings, things like that,
Right.
in the Central District,
Yes.
in the Quad Cities area for the
In the Rock Island Division.
the Rock Island Division, Central.
Right.
So you got to know the Illinois judges pretty well.
Very
as
well. Very well.
Right.
And
In fact, haven't they offered you an office over there?
They
When
have.
you go on recall status.
They have. And I should say, too, in 2 years ago, the judges of the Central District of Illinois awarded me a certificate and a memento in appreciation of the work that I had done for them, and it was a total surprise to me and a great honor. I mean, my view was it went with the job, but as the chief judge explained to me, you don't appreciate, and I didn't, how much I saved those judges in terms of drive time, problems of a minor nature that they needed to be spending other time on. So I was very, very pleased to receive that honor. That it was just
Well deserved. They didn't give me one. I did half a dozen things there. Everything.
Well, I'll put you on the list.
No, they were most accommodating to us when we moved over there.
It has been and continues to be a very good relationship between the two districts. At the present time, Judge Sarah Darrow is a U.S. district judge. She was an assistant U.S. attorney. She sits in Rock Island, and we continue that good relationship.
Well, good. Well, now, since you've been a magistrate judge, of course, you were chief magistrate judge for a while. That's a term we've all served.
That's right.
You made a lot of extra money at that, did you? Oh, yeah.
More than I can say
Right.
in front of this audience.
Right. Not.
Like zero.
But anyway, you did your time in that. But also, one of the things I know you had an interest in over the years is the Sedona Conference.
Correct.
And you've been a presenter at the conference.
I have been. I've been asked to, and I've been appointed to the Judicial Advisory Council for the Sedona Conference, and and that was in large part the doing of then Chief Judge Robert Pratt, who read about the Sedona Conference, looked like it might have some benefit for this district, and I'm still not sure why he didn't himself go, but when he was Chief Judge, I didn't have time, and asked me if I'd be interested in going to a Sedona Conference, and I said sure, and I did, and learned a lot more about a lot of things I didn't know anything about, and which I now know a little bit about, but it is in the burgeoning area of electronic discovery and all the things that are part of our modern society.
Well, you've kind of become the expert in electronic discovery and among judges in our...
I wouldn't say expert, but I certainly have a keen interest in it, and I probably have enough knowledge to almost be dangerous, but it's helped me when we've had discovery disputes and trial setting issues or progression orders in getting things done. And I think to some degree too, it's been a wake-up call for lawyers some of whom just ignored it because they thought it'd go away, others who thought it might be important but really didn't want to get involved because they weren't that adept at computerized legal matters, and some of the lawyers who are, real geeks about that. So we see all levels in this district, and I think it's true for all the judges. There are varying amounts of competency in electronic discovery, and I sure won't claim to be an expert by any stretch, but I know enough to be able to recognize problem areas that I can at least nudge the judge or the lawyers in the right direction and be able to work through that.
One thing we talked about Debbie Moses, who's been your judicial assistant all the way along, but also you've had the same law clerk,
Jed Brokaw.
Jed Brokaw,
right.
Who came with you from Lane & Waterman, right?
He did, and that Jed had been at Lane & Waterman, I'm going to say 5, maybe 7 years by the time, and maybe longer, but by the time I was offered the full-time position. He had clerked for Justice Andreessen on the Iowa Supreme Court after his graduation from Drake Law School. And I knew Jed was not really a happy associate because he was frustrated by firm politics and all the things that go with being an associate. But everybody recognized him in the firm as being a marvelous researcher and a very good writer. And so I thought, I got nothing to lose. I'm going to ask him if he would be interested in leaving Lane & Waterman and coming with me, and he didn't hesitate. And that was probably the best decision I made, next to having Debbie move up from her position as a deputy clerk to be my judicial assistant. But because Jed had that experience as a law clerk as I did, he was no stranger to drafting orders and memoranda and research, and so it was a very, very good fit.
Well, you've been a lawyer and a judge now for 41 years plus. Did I do the math right?
I think you're right. I
think so.
I graduated from law school in 1972, took the Indiana bar in June, was admitted to the bar there in September. So I would have been, it's slightly over 41 years.
It's December 2013 now, and you're going to retire
sometime.
Your successor has been is going through the
designated,
going through the
right.
approval process. But you'll be, you're February 1 or thereabouts. Whenever they let you go.
I hope. And my successor, Helen Adams, is obviously a very qualified person, and she's like us, a former law clerk, and I think I'm happy because I think that's the first of Hal Viator's former law clerks of whom I'm aware that has become a judicial officer. So that's good. So as soon as her background check is completed and it can be arranged for her to be sworn in, then I will hopefully just move on to the next phase.
But the next phase, you're not going to quit entirely, because you're going what we call recall status. I always like to think of that as being remembered, but actually it means you're retired, but you're recalled to duty, right?
I hope that will work out here in Iowa and in Illinois, and I hope to do some of that in Florida in the wintertime.
Because you're going to be down there some.
I hope.
So, actually, you can move around a lot more as a recall judge.
That's right. That's exactly right.
And doing some of the same things you've been doing before, but on a part-time basis.
That's right.
Part-time again.
Part-time again. That's right. Return to my roots.
Well, so what's the, other than that, continuing to do a little judicial work, what do you want to do when you aren't working full-time as a judge anymore?
Well, I want to stay active, and I do try to exercise and work out as often as I can, daily if I can. I want to do some more bicycling. I'm going to, I think my wife and I are going to buy kayaks and do a little ocean and.
Well, stay close to shore, will you?
Well, we'll see.
Okay.
We'll get a transponder.
Don't go out to the dry Tortugas.
Well, I don't think we'll get that far. And I think we're going to do some traveling. We have a trip planned in the fall of 2014, and as I told you, that's one of those adages you have to be careful about. If you want to hear God laugh, tell him your plans. But